Okay, so this week we are on week 3. So you'll see for this week, you are required to do chapter 5 and 6. And those are the 2 chapters I'll demo kind of a little bit later, but we're going to also answer a question from the prior week. So that's kind of what we're going to work on. So some general reminders also. I want to talk about general reminders each week if I have things that I notice in the textbook that have been problems for students, or if you've emailed me a question that I think will help other people. So the first thing, and I mentioned this last week as well, whenever you need to access files, make sure you use the folders we created in week 1. The textbook always tells you to pull it from a different location, but you know where you set up the folders from the Moodle videos, so that is what you're going to use. And then the other thing I didn't point out before, but I want to point it out now, and I'm going to show some screenshots just to illustrate why these are important. But there are in the text margin many warnings, and ensure you read those as you go through, and even highlight ones. Like some of them are minor, it'll be just a little thing explaining something to you and you'll note that, but other times it'll say warning and it'll give you something that's very, very critical for the course. And if you do it wrong, it might create an issue. One other thing I wanted to mention from a question I had that I didn't put in the slides, but I just thought of it right now, is that if you make a mistake in an entry and you want to correct it and you go print your general ledger report, you will have an extra entry. So we didn't talk about this last week because we had just been starting with the journal entries. But let's say, for example, you went into entry 3 and you made a mistake and you went into the little pen to correct it. And then after that, you hit post. When you go into your general ledger report, if you see all of the entries, you will see what Sage actually does is it takes your original entry 3, reverses it automatically, and reposts the correct one. So depending on the options that you're showing in your report, you might see all of those. But your journal entry numbering might be a bit different as well, and that doesn't matter. So let's say you are looking at the solution and you see your entry is a number 3, and the textbook says that was a number 2 because you had posted something. Maybe you came back to an entry and entered it after. As long as the date is correct, as long as the amounts and everything else are correct, don't worry about the journal entry numbering at all. Because as I said, if you make corrections or if you just do something in a different order, it doesn't really matter what journal entry number it is. Okay, so a lot of times I have that where the entry numbers will change. That doesn't matter at all. So last week we had the question about the test account. So I went back to look at what the textbook's using this for, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So when you're entering a new company from scratch, you have to put all of the opening balances in. So maybe you had a manual ledger and you need to go in and say, okay, in the bank account for December 31st of last year, it had $100. You put that in, and then you do cash on hand and you do everything else. Now, in the textbook, it's giving you all those balances to enter. But the thing that happens is if you have a mistake, you can't really continue on. So that's the problem. So rather than plugging somewhere, so let's say you're out by, it's not balanced, the debits and credits don't balance, and you're out by $10,000. You could go into any specific account and say, okay, instead of cash being 1,000, I'm going to put it as 11,000. Problem with doing that, obviously, is your cash was never $11,000, and you might forget to go back and change it. So what you would instead do is, if you needed another debit, you would put it into what's called the test account, and then you would go back and try to correct it later, because you're able to correct opening balances later once you've entered all the opening. And that is a warning in the textbook. It says right on the, I put it right on the slide here, you can finish entering history when the trial balance is in balance. Afterward, you cannot change opening balances even if they are incorrect. You'll need to make adjusting entries. Stage 50 always keeps the trial balance balanced. Therefore, checking for a zero balance in the test account can stop you from proceeding with incorrect account balances, which is really good, because again, if you started with cash of 11,000 when it was only 1, and then you make a journal entry to correct it, it looks really weird. People would, like, if the auditors were looking at it, they'd be like, why did you start with 11 if it was 1? Whereas the test account, it's very clear, you started it only as a test account. It's not an actual GL account. You put your 10,000 error in there, and then you do a journal entry to take it out of test and post it to where it belongs. Maybe you just forgot to, oh yeah, you missed entering prepaid expenses that was 10,000, and you can go back and do a journal entry to record that. So hopefully that makes sense. to everyone. Does that help from last week, the question that had came up? Or does anyone have an
so, yeah, I might have to listen to it one more time, the recording, just to fully grasp it. But
yeah, okay, so yeah, and then you can obviously look at it again. And also I did put the text page reference 97, so you might want to look at that as well. Now, it's not something critical in real life. You don't do new company setups very often, but in the textbook, as you're doing it, suffice it to say that if you look and you've created the test account and it's 0, that's all you need to worry about. So hopefully that helps too. If your test is 0 in chapter 4, you are good to go. If you were very, I see that comment, I mean, if you're really obsessive and you make sure that every time you enter a balance, you double check it and check them off as you go, then you'll never use the test account. Then you can just completely ignore it. So hopefully that kind of summarizes that for you.
So Linda, what you're saying is you can open up this test account, and if you're off, you can put it in there and put the comment that it's just an error until a later date, and then you can, once you figure it out, you can readjust
exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so your test account, you put the balance in there up front when you're opening all the opening balances. And I mean, the textbook tells you when to set it up, like, and that it's there. So it's not something you're creating on your own. The textbook tells you to do it. And if you find you're out of balance, you just put the amount in there. And then later you go in and look at your trial balance, match it to the textbook, and then you'll see where you missed an account, and you just do a journal entry to take whatever it is out of the test account.
Becca's question there just clarified my understanding. So that was.
Go ahead. If anyone else has questions, go ahead, but I don't know if anyone else does. Did anyone, maybe if anyone did have a balance in the test account, do you want to share if you did and that you were able to correct it, or is it just a general question about how to use it? Okay, hearing no questions, seeing nothing in the text, so we'll move on. One last thing I want to comment on that is that if you haven't done the chapters, make sure you go through and do them, because it is the only way to learn is to go through the material. So it definitely helps if you do that. Now, to just cover a little more before we get into chapter 5 about the way the textbook is structured. In the first 2 chapters you've already done, you did bookkeeping in a way that would never be done in real life. You entered, well, I shouldn't say never, but very, very rarely would you do journal entries for every single transaction. Because if you had hundreds of transactions, doing a debit and credit for everything would be very onerous. So instead, we're going to get into, in chapter 5, how you would do, and yeah, Ryan said very inefficient, and that is true. Now, if you were a really small business and with very few transactions, then that would be okay. But in general, that wouldn't be the case of how you'd want to do it. So in chapter 5, and you'll see when we get to chapter 6, the same thing, we're now getting into how you would actually do accounting in Sage. So this chapter is going to talk about the payable side, where we make purchases of goods, or we pay our rent, we pay insurance, any expenses that we're recording that we owe money for, or if we pay them by cash, it's going to be done through the payable system. And I'm going to show some screenshots, and later on I'll go in as do a little bit of a demo like we did last week. So we're also going to talk about how we enter and correct invoices and payments. There's also in the chapter how you enter discounts, because sometimes vendors will offer discounts if you pay early. And it'll also talk about how to create and edit suppliers. So that's what's kind of covered in chapter 5 of the textbook. So the company you're looking at here is called Grow and Field. And each chapter, sometimes it'll continue on. In this case, it's a brand new company. And you can see the chart of accounts on page 109. And I mentioned this last week, but make sure that if you're using a company, you would go back to this page to use any of these accounts that they've already set up, rather than creating a new account. If you didn't have a related account, then of course you could do that. So does anyone have any questions about the chart of accounts? No, perfect. Okay, so how does this work? So basically, for making entry for a payable. Rather than going into the general ledger like we did before, we're going to click on vendors and purchases. So I did a screenshot. My screen might look a little different than yours because I might have some other options in my system set up. But you can see vendors and purchases is highlighted on the far right screenshot. And this is, again, the sample company that I'll open up after we're done the slides. Then there's the purchase invoice button, and then there's a payment button I've highlighted. So whenever you're going to record a purchase or rent or anything like that where it's an expense, you would just click on purchase invoice. And then if someone made a payment for something paid later, so for example, maybe you get an invoice today that is dated for today's date, but you need to pay it in 30 days. Well, obviously you'd enter the invoice as a purchase invoice. And then on the left-hand picture, I have a drop down there where you can see pay later or cash. So if it's a pay later, it's net 30, you would set up the invoice as pay later, enter your vendor, and enter all the details you need. If it's a cash thing where someone, you paid it right now, someone came into your location, made a cash payment, and you want to record it right away, then you would just say invoice for cash. And in the chapter, they will give you examples to do both of these types of things. And one thing I like to mention is as you're going through entry by entry, it takes a long time to get used to making sure you select this properly. So right now in the chapter, it's easy because it'll say, here's ones that are paid later, and then it'll say cash purchases. So it's very simple. But later on, when you get through the class, it'll just have like transaction after transaction, and it'll tell you this supplier purchased on account. As soon as they say on account, that means you click pay later. If it says it was a cash payment, then you would hit cash. And I sometimes have made mistakes in this, even in my own business when I've been doing bookkeeping. And then I go to balance my bank at the end of the month and I go, oh, shoot, I'm out by $1,000. And I realize it's because I picked pay later when it was actually a cash transaction. Or it could be the other way where it was a cash and you said pay later, and then you're going to be out as well. So whenever you're out, this is for later chapters, but when you're out, make sure you check your purchases. And same thing when we get into receivables in the next part of the course or next part of the slides here. But make sure that you've done this appropriately. So it's another thing to be very obsessive about is your payment method. Otherwise, you'll be out of balance, and it can be very hard, especially if you've made 3 different mistakes. Let's say because the default is usually pay later, and you had a few cash ones, it might be hard to identify where your problems are until you go and look at all the entries that you've made. So the next topic that I wanted to highlight is recurring entries. And I think I talked briefly about this already. But basically, if you have things that happen every month, every week, every day, or even random, but they're recurring, you don't want to have to do the vendor again, the accounts again, because everything should be the same. So for example, let's say you make it an order for Staples every month where it's office supplies, and you buy a whole bunch of different things. You buy some furniture, maybe you buy some like some, office chairs, whatever. Plus you buy some kitchen supplies, like they sell sugar and things like that for the kitchen in the office, and as well as regular supplies, and maybe buy whatever it is. If you create a Staples recurring transaction, you could enter in all the typical accounts that you have this month, store it as a recurring transaction, and then next month when you go to record Staples again, you would bring up that recurring transaction, take out any or put zeros for the accounts that are maybe you didn't buy a new piece of furniture or equipment, but you did get some of the other items. You're able to change all the amounts, but at least everything else is the same. The payment terms should be the same. Maybe it's always a pay later, it's always Staples, and there's some accounts that always are there. So I've showed the recall recurring transaction screen for the sample company. So you could see in there a couple things I wanted to talk about. And this comes from the text page 117 that they talk about how to do this if you're trying to look it up. But for example, you can see they have Abercrombie Hardware, Key One Lockworks, Lexington Drywall, and there's 4 different ones that are monthly frequency. So when you're setting up recurring transactions, you have many choices. You have monthly, weekly, daily, and random. So random would be ones where I would set up that for anything that I'm going to do recurring, but it's not always at the same time. So if we're going to buy supplies in person and we do it many different days, it might be Monday and then it might be Wednesday and next week it's a Tuesday. There's no, no set schedule for it, you put random and it'll tell you, you can see, for example, Harry's Lumber says random, and it tells you in the sample company the last date it was processed is March 31st, 2025, and there is no next due date because it's random. Whereas the monthly, it shows you March 31st, there was a bunch of things posted, the next due date would be April 30th. And at the top picture that I put on there, I highlighted the buttons for the recurring transaction. So you can see the first little arrow that goes down, if you hover over it, it says store as a recurring. So every single module that you do like if you're doing a payable invoice, if you're doing a receivable, if you're doing a general ledger entry, as you record your first instance of it, so your first rent payment under purchases, your first journal entry to adjust, say, to record depreciation at the end of the month, the first receivable for a regular monthly customer, the first one where once it's all entered in completely done, you would click that button called store as recurring transaction. When you do that, it will ask you the frequency. You would put monthly if it was rent, put monthly if it's payroll, if it's insurance, maybe it's annual, you could set that up as well. And then it'll be stored for you. And then next month, when you go to post your insurance or your rent or whatever it is that's monthly, you would just click the arrow that is going upward that's right beside the store and recall, and it will give you that list like the one I showed at the bottom there for Abercrombie. If you want to post that, you just select it and then you go into it, adjust anything you need to if the amounts are different, and then you post it. So that's what's going to save you a lot of time in Sage, is these recurring entries or recurring transactions. So again, you can do this for purchases, you could do this for receivables, and you can do this for general ledger. Any questions on this process? Has anyone, that's the other question I should ask, has anyone started already on Chapter 5? Okay, nobody's answering, so I'll presume maybe no one has. That's obviously the thing you're supposed to be doing this week is Chapter 5 and 6. But anyway, the recurring entries, definitely the textbook will tell you when to set them up. Oh, and Ryan answered, yes, he's done 5, almost done 6. And that's great. So Ryan might be our little test guy that can tell us any questions. And Becca, you're starting after class. And that's what all you need to do. If you start after we're done class today and you continue working through Wednesday, where we don't have a video class like we do today or a Zoom one, other than when we have holidays. That's why it's set in the calendar. And on May 23rd, Monday is a holiday. So we will do this same kind of class on the Wednesday instead. But starting after class is completely fine. If you do have time and you want to start before, it means you can ask a question directly in class that we can go through. Okay, so that's the one advantage if you do start early. All right, now the other thing I wanted to talk about for payables is linked accounts. And it does talk about it in the textbook on page 20, but I wanted to highlight it again because this is one of the problems I had when I first left Deloitte & Touche in the accounting firm and started working at a company that was using Sage. So basically, if you're working in an accounting firm and you're making some entries for your client, you do everything with a journal entry, just like we did in the last 2 chapters. So the company might be using Sage, your client could be using Sage to do all their purchases, their receivables, their whatever they're doing, right? Some journal entries potentially. Then they would send their Sage file to Deloitte, let's say, or whatever firm they're using. And then Deloitte, in my case where I work, we would go do some adjusting journal entries at year end for them. So we might post an entry for depreciation because the client didn't know how to do that. But we also might say, hey, you forgot to do an accrual for insurance, let's say they hadn't paid it. So we might want to do the accrual, but we're not going to record the invoice because we don't have any invoices. So we would do a journal entry for that. And we might not post it directly in their Sage, but the point is we would do a journal entry in our system at Deloitte, just like we were doing in the textbook where we would debit insurance, credit insurance payable, let's say. Well, then what happens, though, in the client's case is, of course, they have to put that as an invoice when they get the invoice, and they can do an accrual journal entry too and reverse it at the beginning of the year. But the payables linked account in Sage can never be posted to in this chapter. So in the earlier chapters, we had an accounts payable journal entry that we could do a credit entry to. But the payable linked account is something you can never do a journal entry to. So in the notes in the textbook, it says the direct link between payments and purchases journal for each supplier provides a further reason for using the purchase journal for purchase. Outstanding amounts and accounts are calculated and displayed automatically, and ledger balances and supplier records are updated automatically. Furthermore, you cannot reverse debit and credit amounts in error. So basically what's happening, if you think back to your introductory accounting, you would always have a subledger account, and all the supplier records added together for the subledger would total your ledger control account, which is your accounts payable. Does everyone remember that? So let's say, for example, I owe Staples $1,000 and I also own a hardware company $500. I would have a subledger account for Staples. I would have a subledger account for hardware, ABC Hardware Company. Those two added together are $1,500. So in my accounts payable ledger account, it would show $1,500. So in Sage, when you're using the purchase module, you would never be able to credit in a journal entry the accounts payable linked account. The way that the linked account is worked is that it automatically posts stuff there when you do a purchases entry, okay? So the other thing I wanted to mention is that if you are doing a credit entry for this, in the chapters, it'll be set up correctly, but in practice, sometimes people, when they set up Sage, they forget to say that you can't post something to a specific entry. So in real life, if you can post, it probably means there's a problem with your system setup. But in the course, obviously, they will tell you exactly, if you're doing it, how to do it. One other thing to note is that the good thing about doing purchases is that if you go into a purchase invoice for Staples, you do not have to enter the entire journal entry. And I'll show this when I do the demo. But basically, if you go in to enter Staples as your vendor and you enter office supplies for $1,000, you do not in that screen need to say I'm crediting accounts payable. The system knows that it does that for every single purchase. So you're not doing a full journal entry. It's not going to show you debits and credits at all. All you're doing is you're entering the expense that you need to do. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Or does anyone have questions about that? I mean, the demo might help a little bit, but Ryan's saying it makes sense. So that, and again, this makes things way more efficient than doing journal entries for everything. So then when we get into chapter 6, basically it's kind of the same as chapter 5, except we're doing the receivable, the customer side versus the purchase and the expense side. So we'd cover accounts receivable, how to record sales revenue. The chapter is going to go through how to enter and correct customer invoices and payments. It's going to show you how to create and edit customers. It also will explain how to do credit card processing. And I just put the page number in case you're trying to look that up again. It's page 176. And then it also talks about how to record NSF checks and shows you examples to do that on page 177. And as you work through, of course, you'll be doing these things anyway. So if you are doing a receivable transaction, instead of going into vendors and purchases, you're going into the customers and sales, and then you would enter a sales invoice or a receipt from a customer. Okay, so you can see that over time, you'll get used to doing these. And right now in the chapters, they will be very specific. It has one thing in the chapter, like when you're in chapter 5, it's all purchases. When you're in chapter 6, it's all customers. So customers versus vendors. But in later chapters, you'll be having all of these together. You'll just have a week of transaction. And then you're going to have to assess, okay, we sold goods to, Joe Smith. Well, then you're going to go into customers and sales and enter a sales invoice. Or it'll say, I purchased goods from Staples. Then you have to go into vendors and purchases. Okay, so later on, you will have to figure these things out on your own in the chapters, whereas right now it's very directed. And that's where you want to do the practice of these earlier chapters so you get used to picking the right things later on in the course. So next week, we're going to start chapter 7, and that's something that we're going to have over a couple weeks because it's a lot longer. And obviously on Wednesday, you just this week keep working through the textbook chapters. So that's all I have other than the demo, which I'll do shortly, and then we'll get into questions. So I'm going to stop my share right now. and share something different. So I know I have Sage, so let's see here. Okay. Can someone give me a thumbs up that they can see Sage now instead? Or put it in the chat. I get a thumbs up from Devin. Thanks, Devin. Okay, so just to show a couple things that I wanted to, it's good to show it on a screenshot, but customers and sales, if I wanted to enter a sales invoice, there's two things I can do. I can go into sales invoice, click the drop down and go invoice. In there, it's create invoice, find invoice, or adjust invoice. But I actually never do this myself. I never go into these little buttons. All I do is I click sales invoice. It comes up, which hopefully it'll come up for you in a minute here. Does everyone see the little screen that popped up there? Hopefully it does. So in here, I can actually do all the same things as in that drop down. So if I wanted to enter a new invoice, I would pick my customer, whoever it is. I would pick the description. I would put in the amount. There's a tax code here. There's the account, which has been defaulted. Or if I wanted to enter a recurring invoice, I could click on the recall recurring transaction. It has the list. I could pick one here. Let's say I want to enter SQ Shopping Center. I can go select. In there, it shows already item description, January 31st, 2015, engineering consulting, $1,000. And basically it has the account already set up. And if I needed to change, so the base amount and the price, because it says it's an hourly rate in this particular case. So if I needed to change the number of hours, the quantity here is 0.2617. If I needed to change that, I could just change that amount here. Let's say I change it to 1 hour. You can see that the amounts change. And then I could just go ahead and process this for the next period. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I think it won't let me because it's a sample company anyway, but I can obviously do that here. If I wanted to restore this, let's say I change it and I think I'm going to have regularly 1 hour, I could go store again and store it and say, okay, and then it'll say, do you want to update it? So you can do that as well. The other thing, let's say you realize you made a mistake in an entry and you're in this screen, you could click this little pen, and you could do this in both the purchases and the receivables. So you can click here and it'll show a search. You can say which ones you want to find. If you knew it was a specific customer, you could pick that one and go okay. If you want all, and it'll show me all of the different customers I have. So if I want to fix Marine Dental Center, I could select it and it'll say, are you sure you want to discard this one? Because I was showing you this ASCII. I could say yes, because I didn't change anything in it. I didn't want to process it. I was just showing it. So here's Marine Dental. I could say, oh, shoot, it should have been 4 hours. So I'm going to change it to 4 hours. It'll change all the amounts and I could process that. So as I mentioned, you can adjust right in here. You could recall a recurring. You could store recurring. And let's say you realize you shouldn't have posted this. So let's say, for example, you posted a transaction and you go, oh, shoot, I did this one. It's totally wrong. I didn't have this month. It was maybe you just posted a recurring one that didn't actually happen this month. You could then go in this little X and go void invoice. So if you click void here, are you sure you want to void this? If I said yes, then it would void that particular transaction. So again, these are ways you can fix things without going back to the beginning. So if you want to just get rid of one thing you did, you can void it here. If you want to adjust it, you can click the pen here. So I think that's probably enough demo for the sales. The other thing I just want to remind you is if I was setting up a brand new one, again, I talked about the payment method being critical. If it's pay later, that's fine. But if it was a cash sale, make sure you change it here. Okay. And if you set something up as a cash payment, there would be nothing else you have to do. Let's say you have a pay later. If you pay later, what you need to do then, I'm going to get out of the screen and show you that. If you had a pay later sales invoice and you're going to make the actual payment for something that's been set up as an invoice, in this case, this is the customer paying you. I'm still thinking payables because I'm in the sales one right now. Let's say you set up a sales invoice for the customer's paying you later. What you would do then for the receipt from the customer is you'd go into receipts. This screen would come up. You would say how they paid. Did they pay by check, by cash, whatever? Usually it'd be check if it's a pay later. You would say who it came from. So let's say the shopping center gave me some money. You can see in here all the different invoices that have been created for this particular customer. So if they paid me the $229.67 that they owed from January 31st, I would click here and hit the amount received and click process. If you go in here to receipts, in the textbook, say it tells you to enter a customer receipt and there's nothing in here, it may mean that when you created the invoice initially under sales invoices, that you hit cash. So if that happens to you, because I've had students that this has happened in past courses, what you would do then is you can't do anything in this screen, obviously. So in that case, you would go out of receipts and go, oh shoot, I must have set it up as a cash sale, or I forgot to set it up entirely. So then all you would do is go back to sales invoices, and you could go into here, pick the one that was wrong by hitting the pen. You could search for it again. I could go in, pick the one that is in note, and if this said cash, I would just change it to pay later, process, and then I could go back in and enter the receipt at that time frame. Does that make sense to everyone? So again, the textbook will show you how to make these adjustments, but sometimes you make a mistake that the textbook didn't intend you to make, and you have to correct it. So that's what I wanted to talk about here. If you have to do that, say you created a sales invoice wrong and the receipt didn't work, you can still go in and correct it. It just means you're going to have extra entries from what the solution says. But at the end of the day, your trial balance will still match as long as you make the correction. Your balance sheet and your income statement will also still match. And you would never lose marks on an assignment or an exam if you had extra corrections than what the solution shows. Because obviously we can make mistakes in data entry. It does not mean you need to start over. It just means you correct the mistakes and then make sure your accounting is correct at the end of the period. Does that help with some clarification for people? Any questions on that? Ryan says all good. So anyway, that's pretty much the customer side. On the vendor side, there's not really that much different. It's the same kind of idea. If you go into purchase invoices, it's going to show you that you can enter a new one. You could go and recall a recurring one, right? It's the same thing. Again, same thing that I talked about. You make sure you hit pay later or cash. So it's pretty much the same process. The other little thing I wanted to demo or talk about a little bit is that anything you do repeatedly, you want to set it up in shortcuts. Now, the textbook will show you where you, like it'll demo it at some point, it'll tell you to add a shortcut for a purchase invoice or whatever. But you do it by clicking this little shortcut button. And you can do this for things the textbook doesn't tell you to do it for if you'd like to. So in here, vendors and purchases, I make sure that I have common things. Like I want to be able to create an invoice. So you would look through here and find where the create an invoice is. So create, there's so many things here. There's credit notes, there's find purchase, adjust purchase, pay credit card bills, pay expenses, whatever it is. So make sure you set up different things. So you don't add vendors very often, so I wouldn't set that up, for example, as a shortcut, but certainly for the regular things that you do, it would be very helpful to do it. So paying expenses would be very common. So you could just add it to the shortcut there, for example. And let's say, I'm just going to show what I could do. I could go into customers and sales and say, I want to create a sales invoice. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. And then for reports, let's say I'm regularly wanting to look up some financials like a balance sheet and an income statement. I can add all of the, oh, I have to click standard balance sheet and then income statement. Let's say I want a standard and click add. You can see they all appear in my shortcuts. So now if I go into pay expenses, it will automatically, that's the payment screen, which again, that's one, but I would also want to have the sales invoice set up too. And here I only did one thing for each one, but of course you might want to have creating a sales invoice and doing a receipt. And then here you might want to have the purchase invoice and the payment all in here. So depending what you're doing, but if I click balance sheet now that I've set it up, it'll automatically bring up the balance sheet for me. So if you want to do that for things as you don't want to do this initially, but as you get used to doing things, if you want to add a couple more things in here and the textbook doesn't tell you to, it's okay to do that. Just make sure you don't have so many shortcuts that you have to scroll down and you can't even see them all. So in my system, I have probably about 8 different shortcuts I have, usually the purchase invoice, the customer invoice, a lot of things like that, and then the reports that I use. And there's other things we're going to learn later on in the course that we'll talk about where you might have more shortcuts. The other thing, of course, here I would want is my journal entry. So if I'm doing lots of journal entries, obviously I would want that as well. And that one is under the company here, which that's the one that's a little tricky to find. So with purchases and stuff, it's easy. Customers and sales. There's the vendors and purchases. Those are simple to find. There's also employees and payroll once we learn payroll, but the journal entries are under company here in the shortcut. So under company, you go there and it has one called create journal entry. So if I add that there, now whenever I want to create a journal entry, I go there and it will show me the journal entry screen. So any questions on the demo there or any other questions? Because that's pretty much all I wanted to demo for now. So if anyone has questions, I see one coming in on the text. It says, I have a quick question. The practice that we're doing for each chapter is for marks or just practice? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Everything you're doing through the textbook right now is for your own practice. There is no marks assigned for it, and there's no specific deadline. However, when we get to the assignment, obviously that'll be different. You will be doing something from the textbook, and I will, at that point, I will tell you what you're doing, and then obviously there will be a deadline. But for everything you're doing to date right now, there is nothing that is for marks. So for marks, you just have the term exam and the assignment. There's also a final exam too. I think you meant to say term exams, right? Yes, and so the exams will be on stage, yes. So in this course, you really can't have just say a multiple choice exam. It doesn't make sense. We can have some multiple choice questions. Like when I did it in person, we might have a few talking about some of the things you might record. But generally speaking, in this course, most things you're doing are going to be going in and recording transactions in Sage. And then I would be reviewing your actual Sage file and your reports to make sure you did things correctly. So it's almost it's actually like a real life, like I could tell you, do the accounting for this week, and I'd be marking the accounting for that week as an example. And that's why I'm telling you to do the practice, because everything you're doing in the chapters now is exactly what you're going to be tested on. Any other questions? No questions? Okay, well, we will end the recording. If you have questions later on, certainly email them to me. And if it's a question I think will help the rest of the class, obviously I will include it in the session for next Monday. Or is next Monday the holiday? Now let me look at my calendar. Oh, next Monday is the holiday, so I guess it's good to talk about it. So next Monday, I don't know if anyone else noticed it's the long weekend coming up, so good to talk about that. We do not have class on the 23rd because it is a holiday, so our next class will be on the 25th. One other last question I wanted to ask. A lot of people were saying they couldn't see the recordings for some reason. Is anyone on the call? And then later they figured it out. So I'm not sure if other people have you guys all been able to watch the recordings or tried to watch them?
I was able to.
Okay. And you just clicked the link that I put, the link, and it was easy? Like, and you've done multiple weeks? It wasn't, you could just do the first week, you couldn't do the second or anything like that?
Yeah, I had no problem getting in them. I just, for some strange reason, the very beginning of class was I could not get into the Zoom class, but today I did, and hopefully the rest of the classes to come I can get in. But I don't know, for some strange reason, last class it took me like 20 minutes to get into the Zoom meeting, and I don't know, maybe it was my computer on my end, I'm not sure. But
yeah, and it could be the computer, your internet connection, that kind of thing. That certainly might happen. So, and Ryan says he has the links saved in a Word file, so that's good. Yeah, save all your links because that's fairly easy. And then the other question for practicing, are there any other practices? No, there isn't necessarily other practice, because doing the chapters, there is a lot of work to do in there as it is. So that's pretty much all the practice that you're doing. All right, well, I'm going to end the recording. I'll stop the share here. And we will talk to you guys all next Wednesday.